so we'll go ahead and start with Song of Songs. And so again, for the record, we're not going to get into a lot of the details as far as like we're not going to go into, a lot of the passages. Now listen, not because I was afraid to do it, but just because we just didn't have time. So we're still going to talk about it, obviously, and talk about some of that stuff. And we're going to talk about how Song of Songs has been interpreted. And it's kind of interesting how people have interpreted the book specifically to get away from what it clearly says. So, with that said, note that the Song of Songs is a celebration of sexual love between a husband and a wife. Sexuality in the context of marriage between a man and a woman, the biblical view is a gift from God, right? That's the point of the book. Note that children are not mentioned, okay? So in other words, it is sexual love for the sake of sexual love, right? It's a pleasurable thing, right? And so it's there, and in the context of this book, it's there for pleasure, and it's meant, for pleasure. The book is a corrective for both the treatment of sex as a highly casual event, right, as we often have today, and they had back then as well, but also against the view that it's taboo, right? And so again, within everything that we're saying, obviously, is in the confines of the marriage relationship, and we'll talk a little more about that in a minute. So note, of course, that the book is associated with Solomon, right? And so the first verse says, the Song of Songs, and the ESV says, which is Solomon's, right? So what does that mean exactly? Well, the problem is, and some of your translations may say something different, but the problem is that the Hebrew is unspecific in the preposition. So it is either Song of Songs of, to, for, or about Solomon, right? But you don't know for sure which one it actually meant. But it clearly has Solomon in it, right? But it doesn't necessarily say that it is written by Solomon, and it is possible that he is cast as the bad guy in the book. And you're probably thinking, wait, what? So when we get through the different interpretive methods, we'll talk about that a little more. Why would we doubt that Solomon wrote the book? Well, if the book is a celebration of a monogamous relationship in biblical marriage between one man and one woman, then we might see where Solomon may not be the poster child for that relationship, right? Because he said he had, 700 wives and 300 concubines. I always mix them up because I always think it should be 300 wives and 700 concubines. But it is the opposite. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. So he's really not the example. And so for him to be the one most associated as being in this relationship, that gives a lot of people cause for, to question, whether that's what that means. And again, specifically because the first verse doesn't necessarily say that it doesn't say that he wrote it. All right, so how has it been interpreted? Well, first of all, the traditional way that it's been interpreted is really funny. It's what we call the allegorical method, right? So how many of you know what an allegory is? Perfect. All right. So an allegory is when you have a story that seems to be about one thing, but it's really about something totally different, right? So you read the story and you think, So for instance, I read in I think my senior year in high school, I read the book Animal Farm, okay? And I took it in my math class, and my math teacher said, you're a little old to be reading a book about animals taking over a farm, aren't you? Well, he didn't understand that Animal Farm is an allegory. It is an allegory about the Russian Revolution, right? And so the book, even though it is about a bunch of animals taking over a farm from the farmer, it's really about the Russian Revolution. And so you have each character in the book. So you have the pigs, and they're the ruling class in Russia at that time, like the revolutionists, because they end up, they take control, but then they end up, taking everything and, running a dictatorship and all that. So they get to be the pigs. You get the horses. They're the ones who do all the work, but they don't ever get anything. And so each character represents someone else or something else. And so even when you get to the pigs themselves, so you've got one pig that represents both Lenin and Karl Marx, right? He's the one that sparks the revolution, Old Major. And then you have Stalin, right, as one of the pigs. Napoleon, his name's Napoleon in the thing. And then you have one that represents Trotsky. And if you know anything about the Russian Revolution, those two fought for power after the revolution, and Stalin ended up winning out. And so each character actually represents somebody else in the Russian Revolution. And so it's not really a story about animals taking over a farm, but that's what you're reading, right? And so you just have to know what else it's about. So, so if this is an allegory, what is it an allegory for? Well, historically, for Jewish people who take it as an allegory, it is an allegory about God and his relationship with Israel. And then for Christians who take it as an allegory, it then extends on to Christ and his relationship with the church. Why would they do that? Why would they make it allegorical? Because it seemingly takes the sex out of the book, right? So it's not no longer about those, those taboo things. It's now about all of those relationships. Note that the Catholic Church banned the literal interpretation of the book in the 4th century. And children were not allowed to read it. And so the problem with the allegorical reading is that it clearly seems to be about sexual things. And so then to make it an allegory about the other makes it a little strange, right? Like it's a little uncomfortable. To me, it makes it more uncomfortable to allegorize it than just to say it is for what it is. Note, though, that there still are some allusions in the New Testament to it. So, for instance, Revelation 3:20 says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him, and he with me." Right? So you've got Jesus saying he's standing at the door and knocking. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come to him and eat with him, and he with me. Note that this is an allusion to Song of Solomon 5:2, right? "I slept, but my heart was awake. A sound, my beloved is knocking. Open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one, for my head is wet with dew, my locks with the drops of the night." And so what that is, though, it's an allusion to. It's not an allegory. It's not like saying, all of this is really about Jesus. It's just Jesus referring back to in Revelation, which is obviously symbolic anyway. But it has Jesus calling back and calling to people's minds that they would remember from Song of Songs. They remember that moment because it's a pretty stressful moment where, she doesn't open the door, right? And then he leaves. So he's like, okay, well, I'll go somewhere else. And so then that creates a stressful moment. And so the point there is, hey, remember in Song of Songs when she doesn't open the door and then the man leaves, well, I will always open the door if I'm knocking. If you open the door, I will, we will have our, a relationship. Obviously not, what their relationship is. All right, so that's allegory, right? So you have the dramatic method of interpretation, which sees this as a play, right? It is a drama written out as a play. And it either has two characters with Solomon and the Shulamite, which is the woman, plus the chorus. You have the chorus of women, there as well. Or you have three characters. You have the shepherd, which is the actual man that the Shulamite loves. You have the Shulamite, and then you have Solomon as well. And then we'll get to Solomon in the next part as far as how he would fit into that situation. Then you have the literal method, right, which seems pretty obvious when you read it. It is simply a collection of love poems. And it either, depending on how you interpret it, again, it either has a cohesive, consistent storyline or it does not. It's either a collection of love poems that are only semi-related, or it is a complete story that is roughly related and tells a basic story, even though there's some dream sequences where she's dreaming that she's out maybe, and all of those different things. It could go either way. And if you take it literally, you still choose between whether there's two main characters or three main characters. Note that if there are three main characters, if it's the shepherd, the Shulamite woman, and Solomon, it is possible that Solomon is actually being cast in a negative light, as a satirical, light, as a bad example, trying to take the Shulamite woman into his harem, while her true love is the shepherd, who she eventually ends up going to, right? And so you can take it both ways, and if you read it kind of with that in mind, it actually makes sense. You could also look at it as these appearances of Solomon aren't negative, but it's just showing Solomon as the be-all, end-all man, and then the shepherd is being compared to him, right? So it's like she's looking at him, and then Solomon, as he comes in on his wedding day or whatever, or one of his wedding days, right? And then the shepherd is also being compared to him as well. The book, so that's all your interpretive methods. Well, most of them. I didn't do them all, but there's a couple that really I didn't do. But so which one is it? Well, we don't know. We don't know, because there's really not enough information to know exactly what's going on, right? So if you read lots of commentators, this is one of those books where when people get up and they seem really confident about it, I mean, it's hard to be confident about it, because there's not enough in the story to really tell you everything that's going on. And so you kind of have to build, what you can out of it, and it's hard to do. So the book does seem to build from an intimate longing, right? So they seem to be longing for one another. They see each other, and they have all of these thoughts, right? These explicit thoughts. And then to an eventual marriage, right? And so the marriage, if you take it literally, it may be that the marriage or the wedding happens in 4:1 through 5:1. But it's really unclear as to when they got married. So how do we even know that they're married in the first place, right? So that's the next question. And there are some scholars who will say, clearly they're not married because it never says that they're married, right? However, you have to read the book in the context of the biblical view of marriage, right? And when I say biblical, I mean the Jewish view of marriage. So they're not going to have a book in Judaism that's just talking about sexual relations outside of the marriage, because, well, in terms of like where they're just having a fling, okay, it's just not going to happen, because that would have been frowned upon pretty clearly. It is unclear when they are married, and it really depends a lot on which one of those interpretive methods you take, right? So if that's Solomon's wedding, that you see him coming in, and it sounds like maybe at 4. Maybe they're seeing Solomon's wedding, and then right after that, they're actually getting married. Again, it's all somewhat unclear. Then you have these weird night watch scenes, one of them in which she ends up getting beaten up. And so what's the deal with that, right? It seems to be that those are dreams, and they seem to be dreams that she's having based on her anxiety for her desire for her love, right? And so those seem to be like dream states that she's having. However, some will interpret it and say that those are symbolic, if you will, of struggles in a marriage relationship, right? So when she doesn't open the door, right, then he gets mad and leaves. And so that's just indicative of sometimes, there are problems in the marriage relationship. However, she ends up finding him again later on, and everything's fine, right? So for me, it seems to be anxiety-driven dreams about her desire to be with him. Note that however you take the book, it is a piece of literature, right? It is a literary piece. It is a literary creation. It's not some sort of factual narrative where somebody's telling you a story about how they met, like it's like somebody posts on Facebook on their anniversary or whatever. Like, that's not what this is. It is a example of a relationship between two people who are married, eventually at least married, and that the sexual relationship that they have, that's a large part of it, in that marriage, right? It's what a relationship should look like. So a few verses that we'll point out. So note at 1:5 through 6, and this is just an interesting, this doesn't really have anything to do major with the story itself. She says, I am very dark but lovely, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not gaze at me because I am dark, because the sun has looked upon me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me keep of the vineyards, but my own vineyard I have not kept. Right? So note that dark skin, we're talking about people in this area who are all relatively dark skinned, right? So we're not talking about Caucasian people and colored people, right? We're talking about all people who have darker skin, right? Because you're talking about Jewish people and at least. And so what we're talking about is peasants who worked out in the fields versus upper classes who didn't have to work outside, right? And so lighter skin was considered exotic, right? Because if you were lighter skinned, then you obviously weren't working outside and stuff. So it was like, oh, look at you, you're all, it'd be like if we look today at like movie stars and stuff and we're like, oh, how beautiful, they are or whatever. It would be that same type of thing. We're not talking about Caucasian people versus people of color. We're talking about all people of color, basically, and different shades based on the sun baking them. So we're not talking about race. So at 2:7, it says, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or the does of the field, that you not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. Okay, so this is a refrain that we have at 2:7, 3:5, and 8:4. And so this seems to be a caution against rushing the relationship. And it seems likely to be explicitly saying that one should wait until marriage before entering into the sexual relationship that this story is really building up to throughout the whole point. I mean, it's fairly clear that they're having these feelings regardless of when they get married and what ultimately ends up happening and all of that. It's all very explicit language, building up to that. And so those three refrains seem to be saying, hold off until the relationship is right, which again, in Judaism would be when you're married, right? Because nobody would say, oh, it's fine, like today, and, whatever, I'm not knocking, whatever. Culture's obviously different. They would not have even entertained it back then, right? So, I mean, unless you were a prostitute or something, then, and nobody now would be like, oh, are you two married? Oh, you're not married? Are you a prostitute? Right? Like that would obviously be offensive to people today, right? And so, but back then it would have been very, all right. All right. Sorry. I'm not, just for the record, I'm just saying that it would be looked at very differently today. Whereas today, generally people don't frown on those things across our culture, whereas they would have then. All right. So at 4, 1 through 5, okay, so look, I had to go through and do some of the more funny stuff. I was going to leave it out just because of time, but we'll do it anyway. Behold, you are beautiful, my love. Behold, you are beautiful. Your eyes are doves behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats leaping down the slopes of Gilead. And my favorite, your teeth are like a flock of shorn ewes that have come up from the washing, all of which bear twins, and not one among them has lost its young, right? So that she has all her teeth. Your lips are like scarlet thread, and your mouth is lovely. Your cheeks are like halves of a pomegranate behind your veil. And look, it's the tower, and then it talks about, gets a little more, it talks about her breasts and all that stuff. So again, clearly we're talking about fairly explicit stuff here, right? Yes. And so for us, we look at it and we say, well, that's just so odd, right? Well, it's odd because we live in a totally different time. Again, like what I was talking about a minute ago, we live in a totally different time. And so these are people who live outside and, raise animals and all that stuff. So that's normal stuff for them, right? And what's interesting is if you read like Egyptian poetry, you find exactly the same type of poetry, right? It's the same type of stuff. And so it's funny, one of the resources I was reading through, they had one that was right next to it, and it was like the same type of stuff. And so if you were to read widely through ancient poetry and you find this type of poem, then you would find that it's really not that strange. All right, so that's basically that, okay? So again, we went through the interpretive methods. We talked about all that, and then we went through some of the stuff. But again, The problem is we come in and we think, oh, there's got to be we've got to be able to just say this is what it is, and it's you just can't like as far as exactly the storyline is one of the more complicated things. There's just really we don't have a storyline that we can really nail down easily. Or if you look at 5 different commentators, they'll have 5 different outlines of exactly what's going on, right? And again, it's not because they're making stuff up, it's because they're doing the best they can with what they have, and they don't have a lot as far as to work with. All right, so now Ecclesiastes, which is so happy. So first of all, the title, okay? So note that the actual word that I think most of your translations probably have teacher at the beginning, the Hebrew word is koheleth. And we don't really know what that word means, right? Koheleth, we don't know what that means. And so it could mean teacher or preacher. We're not exactly sure, but the way that we get around that to figure out kind of is because when we get to the Greek, right, they use the word Ecclesiastes, right? And so that's where we get the name Ecclesiastes. And Ecclesiastes in Greek means member of an assembly, right? And so it seems to be like the assembler, the person who's assembling people together. So they're speaking to them. So clearly they may be teaching or preaching or however you want to look at it. And so that's why we get the name Ecclesiastes. If you'll read through scholarly works and stuff, they will actually refer to it as Koheleth instead of Ecclesiastes, just because that's the original language. So again, we have the same issue that we had with Song of Songs, with Solomon being the author. Is Solomon the author, right? Well, traditionally we say, yeah, Solomon is the author. Note, he is described as the son of David, but is later identified as a teacher who cannot do anything about the injustices of ranking officials, right? Ecclesiastes 1:16 says, I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. Okay, well, if this is Solomon, and he's wiser than all of the people who were over Jerusalem before him, how many people were over Jerusalem before him?
1.
Well, 2, right? Because you got Saul and then David, of course, right? And so, so it's just 2 other people. And one of them's his dad and one of them's Saul. I mean, so he's not really an example.
Well, Melchizedek.
I don't think they would have considered that. I wouldn't think, but that is a point. I thought about that as I was going through. So, because it technically was a place before. So, is it possible? But actually, let's look at the next one. I have another example. So, no, it's the same thing really. So that could still fall into play. Ecclesiastes 2:9 says, "So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also, my wisdom remained with me." And so again, who are you talking about before? And so, it is possible that he's referring to people who were over that area before. But I think most would argue not, just because he wouldn't necessarily take that as a positive thing. But that is a good point, and it is a possibility.
But I don't think he would have. That would almost be blasphemy against.
Yes.
Melchizedek, or against God's priest.
Well, keep in mind again that when we talk about Melchizedek, Melchizedek shows up in that one spot before Hebrews in the New Testament, right? And so we really just get that one spot, and then we had a psalm, right? And so again, it's really non-specific about Melchizedek. Abraham shows up and gives him a tenth, right? And it says the priest of the Most High. But just for the record, Most High, all of the heads of the deities were he would have been a priest of the Most High, right? So again,
it says God Most High.
But if it says Elohim Most High, so it's Eli Elyon, yeah. So I think it's Eli Elyon, which would be God Most High, which is technically non-specific. Because it could be any God, because Baal is Eli Elyon as well, right? So I'm not saying that it's not Yahweh, but it is not. It doesn't say for sure, and so I don't know. And even then, so let's just say we had. So then you just say, okay, well we got 3. We got then David, Saul, and then you could say Melchizedek because nobody else is mentioned, And so, I mean, you could make that argument, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, it's a possibility. But it seems a little odd that he would say all before him if he was meaning other people as well. That would be one way around it. All right. So the purpose and meaning of the book. So it's got a lot of negative stuff, right? And it talks about nothing new under the sun and all of this. What it seems to be saying, and listen, there's a lot of debate about this. Some people, listen, this book almost didn't make it in, right, into the canon early on, and I hate to say it, but it was the liberals who actually got it in because the conservatives said, in early Judaism, they said this doesn't make any sense. It's a completely horrible worldview. It doesn't need to be in the canon. And this was the Old Testament, right, canon. And so there was debate about it, and so they ended up putting it in. And some people took different views on it, obviously. But it seems to be, and it does seem right, it's that nothing in life can bring you meaning or the pleasure that you truly desire, right? So you can do all the things on earth that you want, trying to find or fill some need that you have within yourself, but you're never going to fill that need, right? You're never going to get enough stuff. And of course, he says that he does. He says he's I tried everything. I did everything, right? And so he said that he could not fill the void. He didn't say it that way, but it's like he could not fill that void. And it seems to be saying that we must lead a life centered around God, right? Trusting in Him to find our true purpose and meaning. Our meaning is ultimately tied to the afterlife, which the author would not have understood. Because note, there is no concept of an afterlife in the Old Testament. There might be a few hints of things, particularly Job, which is actually written later. And then there's a little bit of a hint here coming up in this book, which is also probably written a little bit later. But an ancient Israelite had no understanding of an afterlife, right? It was you died, you were either in Sheol, which is a place where disembodied spirits are. It was neither good nor bad. It wasn't a positive place, but it wasn't necessarily a negative place. You're just there. And then other people would have said you're just dead, right? You're just dead, right? And so Sheol could be used for either one of those, either the grave or an actual place like Hades where disembodied spirits end up. So that idea, notice the idea of a positive afterlife does not come into shape until the intertestamental period. And then, of course, in the New Testament obviously has a more fleshed out afterlife. But he is still ultimately right. There is nothing new under the sun on this earth, but there is something above it. Right? Now, not literally above it, but there is something in their concept. They would have seen, again, like the earth would have been like a snow globe, right? And so the sun and the moon and the stars would have all been inside that solid dome. And then the divine realm would have been up above that, right? And so ultimately they're right. He's right. There's nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new on the earth. It's a pretty bad place at times. But that's not all there is. The problem is he just doesn't necessarily get that. All right, so we're going to kind of go through some stuff and kind of make through his arguments verse by verse, like with just some of the verses that I kind of picked out. So starting at 1:8, he says, all things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing, right? So there's no satisfaction. And he says at 2:1-11, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks, and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, which does sound like Solomon. Delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also, my wisdom remained with me. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil. And this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had extended in doing it. And behold, all was vanity and striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. So basically, he did everything, went everywhere, did everything that there was, and he still ended up in the same spot. Like, this is just useless. It reminds me of The Great Gatsby. If you ever read The Great Gatsby, where part of the point there is that Daisy and her husband, they're rich and they don't care about anybody else, and they're just selfish people, careless and selfish. And Daisy says at one point, she says, I've been everywhere and seen everything and done everything. And the point is, she's not happy. She's still not happy. She gets no happiness. She tries and tries and there's no happiness. And that's kind of where he's ended up, right? He says, I've been everywhere. I've done everything. I've had everything that you could imagine. And I'm just not happy, right? And we see that today with, whether it be sports figures or rock stars or, whatever it is you look at, actors, you look and you think, man, those people look so happy, and they're not happy, right? And then you find out some, terrible thing that they did. Or I'll never forget Darryl Strawberry years ago. Like, I collected baseball cards for a while, and Darryl Strawberry was real big back then. And so I had my Darryl Strawberry baseball cards, and then he was on the news one day, and he'd gotten hooked on drugs and stuff and was domestic violence stuff. And I'll never forget watching that guy who was like such a giant say, Judge, I just want to die. I don't even want to live. I just want to die. And I thought, man, that guy had everything, and he just wants to die.
Didn't he later go into the ministry?
He did, yeah. I don't know if he went into the ministry, but I know he straightened his life up and turned his life around and all of that. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. So seeking ultimate happiness here on earth is the wrong tactic, but one can find happiness in understanding that life is a gift from God, and living like God wants is the key to ultimate fulfillment, right? So then you get to 3:9-13. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart. Yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end, right? So you can't know everything that God knows. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live, right? So look, live a good life, right? You can do that instead of trying to find happiness and in specific items and things. Just, I hate to say this, but live your best life, right? Like, and know your best life is a godly life, right? Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man, right? So life is a gift from God, and you should live it, and you should enjoy it as much as you can. Note, though, the hint of uncertainty and sometimes hopelessness for the afterlife. So at 3:16-22, it says, Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. So he does believe that there will be ultimate judgment, right? So there you have that. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beast, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from dust, and to dust all return. So there's a little bit of hopelessness. Who knows? And here he questions. Do what?
A little bit.
Yeah. Well, because then he says, who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth. So there you have a little questioning. What happens to us when we die, right? So I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? So I actually had I used to work for a Jewish family. And I would talk. There was one of the ladies there. Like we would just talk about like the differences in Judaism and Christianity, and I really enjoyed those moments. And so I was like, well, so then what do you think happens after you die? And she said, we don't know, because of course they have what we call the Old Testament, right? They have the Hebrew Bible. She said, we don't know. There's no, the Bible doesn't tell us what happens to you when you die, right? So she's in the same situation as the author here, right? There's no fleshed out afterlife in the Old Testament. And so it's not until you get, up toward the New Testament before you get a better idea of that. Notice that he says rejoice in his work, right? And again, I bring up another literature, probably inappropriate in this situation, but if you've ever read Candide by Voltaire, right? So it's a lot like Monty Python's The Search for the Holy Grail. If you've ever watched that, it's just a ridiculous thing where the Black Knight gets his arms chopped off and his legs and he's still trying to fight or whatever. Well, it's a lot like that. And you have Candide who's going through all these trials and tribulations and stuff, and he's got his philosophy tutor who says no matter what the situation is, everything's happening for the best. So he sees all these horrible things that happen, but he still maintains, for Candide, that but this is still for the best, right? And he goes through these ridiculous things. This horrible thing happened so that this could happen and that could happen and this other thing so we could have chocolate or whatever. Like that's one of the arguments. Like all these people died, and then ultimately what do we get out of it? Chocolate. So see, if all those people hadn't died, we wouldn't have chocolate. And so he's looking for the love of his life that he lost early on, and then he thinks if he can get her, he'll be happy. And so he's searching for happiness throughout the entire book. He finds her finally, and turns out she's turned ugly. And so then he ends up marrying her anyway, just because he's like, well, I've wanted to marry her all this time, so I might as well do it. But at the very end, they end up buying a house all together. All the characters end up coming back together, and they buy a house. And they end up with a garden that they end up farming, on their garden. And they stop worrying about philosophy, and they stop stressing out about all the politics and stuff that's going on in the world, religion and all of those different things, the religious problems that they're having, because they had Muslims and all these different, Christians and all these people fighting and stuff. And they finally, Pangloss comes up and he says, hey, what about this philosophy thing? He comes up with something. And Candide says, that's very interesting, but let's just tend our garden, right? And so it's interesting because it seems to come somewhat from this. There are all these horrible things that happen in the world, but if we stress out about all that stuff, we can't live the life that God has in store for us, right? And so again, and I say against everything that Joel Osteen says, I don't mean like anything like what he's talking about, but in other words, you just live the life that you believe God wants you to live according to God's commands, and do the best you can. Spread the gospel and do all those things, and things are going to work out. And like the book of Revelation says, it may not even be in this life, it may be in the next, right? So you may end up a torturous death in this life, but you still have hope. Hope that the author of Ecclesiastes did not have, at least he didn't understand, because they didn't have that. And so there is that eventually. So he settles on at 5:7, for when dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity, but God is the one you must fear, right? And then at 7:13 through 14, consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity be joyful, and in the day of adversity consider, God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him, right? And so you take the good with the bad, right? That's what life is about. You can learn from the bad. All of it is a gift from God. And again, if you look at it through the lens of the New Testament, where this is not all there is, then you have even more hope, right? It gives you more hope for living in this life, particularly when things are bad, because this isn't all there is. If I lived this life and my life was bad and I thought this is all there was, that would cause me a lot of stress, right? But if I lived a bad life, meaning like if I was persecuted, or if I lived in another country, let's say I lived somewhere where there was persecution or whatever, then it would be a lot more hopeful, and I could continue on knowing that what I do in this life matters past just this life. And I don't mean what happens to me, but what happens to other people as well, right? In other words, if I spread the gospel to one more person, then that person is better off, right? And so we have that hope in the New Testament that they didn't have. So the answer is almost stop worrying about stuff and live your life according to God's will. I mean, that's kind of what it is. And then, of course, as New Testament Christians, we know more than the author of Ecclesiastes, which is interesting, right? You look back and you think, we know more than they did, right? So, just for the record, nobody in the Bible had the whole story from beginning to end like we have today, right? Like, there was no time really where any of those people who lived during biblical times had the entire story, right? Even when Revelation was written, very few people had all of the books of what we call today the Bible all together in one place, right? And so I always thought that was fascinating. I always say to people, don't you wish that, God would speak to you like he spoke to Abraham and all those people in the Bible? And I'm like, he can. Like, through the word of God, you have the entire story from beginning to end that they didn't have. You have more than they had. Now, I'm not going to say it wouldn't have been cool to hang out with Jesus, but we have the whole story.
When was this whole story compiled first time?
Ooh, you're talking about Ecclesiastes?
No.
Front to back.
Okay, so the first complete Bible I think we have is in like the 4th century that we have in a book form, what's called a codex. Yeah. So the New Testament canon is not done until 398, I think, at the Council of Carthage. And so it's not even until then that they decided for sure these are the 27 books of the New Testament. Yeah. So yeah. Yep. But just for the record, though, Constantine did not decide what was in the Bible. There was an actual process. They had some definitive ways to decide which book should be in the canon. And that's a conversation for another day. But it's not like they just willy-nilly picked books. All right, so that's all that. So now let's look at some of 1 Kings. All right, so we have some left to do. We'll see how we go. All right. All right. So a lot of this, I'm just going to read the pertinent parts, right? And so with not nearly as much explanation, because really it doesn't need a ton of explanation. So at 1 Kings 11, 1 through 13, you have the fall of Solomon, basically, right? So there at 1 Kings 11, 1 through 13, it says, "Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh." So Pharaoh, of course, the daughter of Pharaoh was the first one that it mentioned that he married. And so it's saying, hey, he had a lot of other wives besides her. Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, "You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love, right? So he marries all these women that he's not supposed to be marrying. And note that this is not, I know that a lot of times it seems to be because because we think of Song of Songs as from Solomon, and so we think, wow, he really liked women. Listen, he probably never even saw most of these women, right? These are political marriages, right? Arranged marriages for political reasons and stuff, the vast majority of them. And so to think that he just lusts after women so much that he has to marry all these women, it's really not like that.
And in our translation, it said he loved many forms. So
Yeah, I think where is that? Yeah, mine says he loved too. I think what it's saying though is that he loved marrying them because of what they got for him. I think is the point there. He loved many women. And listen, you're right. It does say that. So maybe he did. Maybe he just loved. I have a hard time. How should I say? I have a hard time seeing that he gave all of these women anything close to equal time, right? Even if we're just talking about attention, that would be really hard. And it's a known thing that people married for, So, but yeah, it could be, I guess.
If he gave each one a day, it would take 3 years just to go around.
I know, right? Yeah.
You have to figure it out.
You'd have one
There's
day.
1,000 women.
Yeah, that's right. You'd have it one.
When they said that the Moabites and Ammonites and all those, the ones that were left there were subject to Israel, subject to.
Yeah, but then remember they start fighting back and forth, and so then sometimes they get a little bit up ahead, and then the others get a little, and so then they start. Remember, some of them they made alliances with and treaties,
Yeah.
And so it was like, hey, we won't, so, and then like the Hittites are way up north, even though there are Hittites in this area, they're actually in Turkey. And so, so they would actually be up further up. So.
What makes it so hard for me to understand is Solomon is supposed to be the wisest man ever, but he does some of the stupidest.
Yeah, and so that's the thing is I
He
think
can be wise and do stupid things.
I think it seems to be that it's wise in his judgments and such, but he clearly goes wrong, right? I mean, clearly.
Well, his judgments within himself.
Right, but I'm saying as far as his judgments in ruling over Israel, right? But yeah, in his personal judgment, it's like, I guess it's like people that have book sense but no common sense, and so it's like.
And what was the life like for these 700 wives? I mean, obviously he was with them one night and then they are banished.
Yeah, if that at all. I mean, they would live on the
property.
On the property, I think. Yeah. I mean,
kids.
yeah.
Stroll through the gardens.
Yeah. But that still may be better life than what they would have had. Maybe, depending on who they were. All right, moving on. So he had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. They're an abomination, particularly because, again, we're sacrificing children to them. And if we're worshiping them, then we are sacrificing children.
But if he didn't have interaction with those women, they couldn't have made his heart go away from him.
Well, it says that he's old, and so therefore he's allowing them to go and worship their gods. And so he basically, for convenience, sets up places for them to worship, right? And so he's just allowing them to worship. And listen, if they're sacrificing his children, he may not be all the time actively there, but if he's allowing this stuff to happen, it'd be just like today. If you looked at the president and said, some of the cabinet members and stuff, right? So if a cabinet member does something crazy, we blame the president, right? Because you picked him, right? We do that for all presidents, right? And so it's a similar kind of thing. It's saying, okay, well, if you're allowing this stuff to happen, you're still responsible, right? You can't just let people do whatever they want to do. And so he did all for all his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrifice to their gods. And the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing that he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep what the Lord commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servants. So note, that was a stipulation, right? It was if you do what you're supposed to do, you will, and remember, we talked about that back then. Yet for the sake of David, your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen. So then you get Jeroboam, one of Solomon's officials, who is chosen to be the king in the north, right? So he's going to be the king of Israel. And I'll go ahead and say it now. So what you end up, it says that he gets, Jeroboam's going to get 10 tribes, and then Rehoboam's going to get 1 tribe. That's not 12, right? And the reason being is because Benjamin is part of Judah, right? And so they, for whatever reason, and I didn't see it, I kind of looked through, I don't know exactly why, they're just north there, and so, but that whole part ends up being Judah, but they're not usually mentioned, it's just Judah. And so I guess it's because that's the important thing, but Benjamin is there, so technically, Rehoboam gets 2 tribes.
When they got their land, Benjamin was inside.
No,
Okay.
Reuben was inside.
Sorry.
Reuben is inside of Judah, so I don't
Yeah,
understand that.
they just, I don't know how they split them up exactly. And listen, because keep in mind that they're attacking back and forth too, so they're losing land back and forth as they go. So it's not like a definitive, like we would think of today. You know, if we split up states and stuff, and then we start fighting, we might get some land and then go back. You know, not that obviously that's going to happen. All right, so at 1 Kings 11, 29 through 33, and at that time, when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, found him on the road. Now Ahijah had dressed himself in a new garment, and the two of them were alone in the open country. Then Ahijah laid hold of the new garment that was on him, and tore it into 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I am about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon, and will give you 10 tribes. But he shall have one tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city that I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. Because they have forsaken me and worship Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and all these other gods, blah, blah, we'll keep going through that. Walked in my ways, doing what is right in my sight, keeping my statutes and my rules, as David his father did, right? So that's bad, okay? So now, Rehoboam has the chance to make things right, okay? And so he comes in, and so he has the opportunity to keep everybody together. But he ends up splitting the kingdom because he's not smart. So at 1 Kings 12, 1 through 14, look, I'll just talk about it, all right? So you have Rehoboam. And so Jeroboam, basically, he's the kind of the leader of the resistance. But they come to him and they say, look, if you'll lower the taxes and the forced labor and all that stuff that your father put on us, because, I mean, he was hard on us, the people, then if you'll relax some of that, then we'll all be together, right? And we'll be good. And so Rehoboam, he's like, all right, you know what? Give me 3 days. Let me think about this. That's a pretty good offer. And so he goes to his father's counselors, right? So the old wise people, and they're all like, listen, your dad was pretty hard on people. And so, I mean, if you'll relax a little bit, they're going to love you forever. And so he's like, that sounds good, but I'm going to ask my buddies. And so then he goes and asks his drinking buddies, and he's like, hey, what do y'all think we should do? And they're like, psh, you tell them that you're going to be twice as hard as your dad, right? And so that's what he does. He goes with that instead. And then that splits the kingdom, right? And so we have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And from that point on, that's what you're going to have. Eventually, and even in this time period, you get the northern kingdom of Israel, sometimes referred to as Samaria, because they have the city Samaria there. And so when you get to the time of Jesus, the Samaritans who were there, it's the same people, right? Intermingled with the people that the Assyrians brought in from other places. And we'll get to that later on. But yeah, I mean, it's still the northern kingdom of Israel are the Samaritans, basically. And then you have the southern kingdom of Judah, which is Jerusalem at that time. And so you still have that fighting. All right, so then you would think that Jeroboam would be all like smart guy, but he's not smart either. So then you get to 1 Kings 12, 25 through 30, and it says, then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there, and he went out from there and built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Well, you would have thought he would have learned from back when they came out of Egypt that this is a bad idea. And he set one in Bethel and the other he put in Dan, and those stayed there for a long time, those high places. Then this thing became a sin, for the people went as far as Dan to be before one. And so note, once the temple's built, you're only allowed to worship at the temple. You can only sacrifice and such at the temple, right? And so he is basically saying, look, I don't want them to leave my land, so I'm just going to set up some convenience places. And so, it's like ATMs, right? We're going to put some ATMs up here. And so that's what he does. And so then he gets them. And listen, it assumes that they're worshiping Yahweh at these high places, at least at first. But that doesn't matter. You're not allowed to do that. And then again, like we talked about before, just being in those places, the high places, because that's so familiar to the pagans, and their background as worshiping pagan gods, It's like, again, it'd be like if we had church in the bar and, anybody in our church who's an alcoholic, if I'm an alcoholic and I go to the bar to have church and I'm like, well, this is familiar territory that I probably shouldn't be in, right? And it might make me be like, I'd like to have a drink here in the bar. It'd be the same type of thing. You're setting up these worship places that are very familiar to them because they worship pagan gods at these types of worship places. And so it's like basically pushing them to worship pagan gods. And that's what they ultimately end up doing. And so he leads the people astray by trying to, prevent people from going down south. And so that's that. All right. So then what we're going to do is, I did not put the part which you'll read at the end of this week on Saturday. You'll get just into Ahab and Elijah. So you'll get just at the beginning of that, but we'll save that. And so, and do that for next week. Thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave a comment or question. And if you found this video helpful, hit like. And if you would like to be notified when new videos are released, hit subscribe and join us next time as we study the Bible in context.